Before the story begins, allow yourself to slow down for a moment, to breathe in gently and breathe out deeply, letting the thoughts of the day gradually settle, because the story you are about to hear is not a loud battle, not about strength or victory, but a very slow journey inward, where each of us carries a personal Goliath, perhaps a fear, an ego, or the pressure to be strong, to prove ourselves, to hold everything together each day. And in this quiet space, as the voice guides you back to the ancient valley of Elah, you do not need to understand. You do not need to remember. You only need to listen and allow your mind to rest, letting the story flow like a gentle stream, carrying away burdens you no longer need until your eyelids grow heavy and you can softly fall asleep in peace. When the sun had not yet fully risen over the valley of Elah, when the air still carried the cool breath of the long night and the ground had not yet awakened from its deep rest, the whole place seemed to be held inside a heavy silence, a silence not of peace but of waiting, as if the valley itself was holding its breath, expecting something familiar to happen again. Because for many days now, every morning just like this, while dew still clung to the grass and the light remained soft, a massive figure would step into the open space, bringing with him the sound of metal striking metal, slow and deliberate footsteps, and a voice that thundered outward, not only echoing in the ears of those who heard it, but slipping quietly into their minds, pressing down on their hearts so that even soldiers standing far away felt their chests grow heavy before a single spear was ever thrown. Goliath always appeared this way, never rushed, never hurried, as though he knew that his presence alone was enough to make an entire army stop. And in that moment, the valley was no longer just a place on the map, but became a landscape of fear, where each Israelite soldier faced not only a giant warrior standing before them, but also a quiet voice rising within their own hearts, a voice whispering that they were small, that they were not strong enough, that they could not win. And it was this inner voice, more than any sword or spear Goliath carried, that kept them frozen in place day after day. Goliath did not know this, or perhaps he knew and did not care, because to him strength was something visible and measurable, something found in height and armor, and the length of a spear, and the echo of a challenge shouted across an open valley. And each time he raised his voice, he was not only challenging the army of Israel, but also challenging the silence itself, as if he needed to hear his own voice to believe that he existed, that he was feared, that he still held power, and somewhere deep inside, Goliath too was listening for the echo of his own words, searching for confirmation from the empty space before him. From a distance, Goliath was the image of absolute power, the kind that made others tremble before they had time to think. But from closer in, if one could somehow step beneath the heavy layers of armor, it might become clear that his strength did not come only from muscle, but from something far more fragile, the fear of being overlooked, the fear of no longer being recognized, the fear that if he did not step into the valley each day and shout the same challenges, the world would forget who he was. And it was this fear that fed his ego, causing it to swell with every step, every echo, every terrified glance from the opposite side. Across the valley, the soldiers of Israel stood in formation, hands gripping their weapons while their hearts felt strangely empty. For they did not lack swords or shields, they lacked stillness within. And each time Goliath spoke, his voice pushed its way into their thoughts, drowning out every prayer, every memory of past deliverance, until they forgot that there had been times when they were even weaker than this, and yet had been carried through. And in that forgetting, fear slowly became a habit, something so familiar that they no longer recognized it as fear at all. They only knew that they could not step forward. Goliath stood there in the center of the valley like an enormous mirror, reflecting the fear of everyone who looked at him. And perhaps what made him truly terrifying was not his strength, but the way he forced others to see their own smallness, to compare themselves, to measure their worth by size and power. And once they believed that their value depended on how big or strong they were, they withdrew before the battle ever began. Yet while all eyes were fixed on the towering figure dominating the valley, something else went largely unnoticed: the quiet weariness beginning to settle into Goliath's movements. Because becoming a symbol day after day is a heavy burden. And each morning when he stepped into the valley, he carried not only the weight of his armor, but the expectations of an entire people. The pressure to always win, to always be feared, to always be Goliath. And in that endless repetition, his ego grew larger while his heart slowly shrank, like a room filled with so much furniture that there was no space left to breathe. There were rare fleeting moments just after his voice faded and before any response came back, when Goliath would stand still for a few seconds. And in that brief quiet, he could hear his own breathing, feel the subtle trembling of metal with each movement. And somewhere very deep, a sense of emptiness would pass through him. But he never lingered there, because silence is dangerous for those who live on noise. And if he remained in it too long, he might be forced to face questions he did not want to answer. And so the Valley of Elah remained, witnessing everything like a silent observer, neither judging nor choosing sides, only holding the memory of every footstep, every challenge, every frightened glance. And within that valley, the story was not only about a giant warrior in a fearful army, but about the meeting of a swollen ego and hearts that had forgotten their own quiet strength, a meeting that could not yet end. Not until someone was willing to step forward, not with force, but with trust, though that belongs to the part still to come. And for now the valley waits, Goliath still stands, and the voice within every heart continues to whisper slowly and steadily, like the breathing of a long night that has not yet passed. Day after day, the sun rose and set over the Valley of Elah, tracing the same slow arc across the sky, as if time itself had fallen into a pattern it could not escape. And with each new morning, the same ritual unfolded: Goliath stepping forward, the sound of his armor announcing his arrival before his voice ever did, and the valley receiving his words the way a deep hollow receives sound, holding it, stretching it, sending it back again as an echo that lingered longer than the words themselves, until even after he had finished speaking, the challenge remained suspended in the air, heavy and unresolved. For 40 days this continued, not because the battle could not happen, but because fear has a way of delaying what the body is capable of doing when the heart is uncertain. And during those days, the soldiers of Israel did not only wait for an enemy to attack, they waited for their own courage to return, for something inside them to shift, for a voice stronger than the one they heard each morning to rise up within them. Yet the longer they waited, the quieter their inner strength seemed to become, until fear no longer felt like a visitor, but like a resident that had quietly moved in and rearranged the furniture of their thoughts. Each repetition of Goliath's challenge did something subtle but powerful. It trained the mind to expect defeat before any movement was made. And what begins as caution slowly transforms into certainty, a certainty that says there is no other ending possible, And this is how fear grows without ever raising its voice, by repetition, by familiarity, by becoming part of the daily rhythm, until the idea of stepping forward feels more dangerous than staying exactly where one is. Goliath understood rhythm, even if he did not name it that way, and somewhere within him there was a knowledge, perhaps learned through many battles, that fear must be fed regularly to remain strong. And so he returned each day at the same time, spoke in the same way, stood in the same place, allowing the predictability itself to work in his favor, because what is predictable begins to feel inevitable. And inevitability is one of the strongest allies of the ego. Yet while the soldiers watched him from a distance, counting the days in silence, something else was also happening, something quieter and easier to miss. The slow erosion of memory, because fear has a way of shortening perspective, narrowing vision until only the present threat exists. And during those 40 days, the stories of past victories, of impossible crossings, of deliverance against greater odds, began to feel distant and unreal, like stories belonging to another people, another time, another life. And when memory fades, identity soon follows, leaving behind only the question of survival. Goliath, too, was being shaped by these 40 days, though in a different way, because repetition does not only affect those who listen, it also affects those who speak. And each time he repeated his challenge, he reinforced the image he held of himself, the image of the undefeatable, the necessary, the one upon whom the outcome depended. And slowly his role hardened into an identity until it became difficult to remember who he was, apart from the armor, the height, the voice, and the fear he inspired. And in that hardening, something within him grew rigid, less able to bend, less able to listen. There is a quiet danger in becoming too certain of one's own power, because certainty leaves no room for learning, and learning is often what keeps a heart awake. And as Goliath stood day after day beneath the same sky, his body remained strong, but his awareness narrowed, focused only on maintaining the image he believed the world expected from him, unaware that the very repetition sustaining his dominance was also slowly draining life from his spirit, turning movement into routine and voice into habit. Among the soldiers, fear began to speak in more personal ways, no longer just as a collective silence, but as individual thoughts whispered in the mind during the long hours of waiting, thoughts that questioned worth, strength, and calling, thoughts that said perhaps someone else is braver, someone else is chosen, someone else is meant to step forward. And when enough people believe that someone else will act, no one does. And so the waiting continued, stretching the days longer than they needed to be. The valley itself seemed to absorb all of this. The waiting, the repetition, the unspoken doubts, and in the still moments between challenges, when Goliath had returned to his camp and the soldiers remained where they were, the air felt thick with unfinished decisions, as if the land was quietly asking a question that no one was yet ready to answer. A question about what truly defines strength, and whether silence is always the same as peace. 40 days is a long time to live inside a question, long enough for fear to feel normal, long enough for courage to feel strange, long enough for the idea of change to seem disruptive rather than hopeful. And by the end of those days, the greatest battle had not yet been fought, but it had already shaped everyone involved, carving pathways in the mind and heart that would make the eventual moment of decision either feel impossible or inevitable. And so the echoes continued to roll across the valley of Elah, morning after morning, not only as sound but as belief, reinforcing the story that size determines outcome and power belongs to the loudest voice, a story that would remain unchallenged until something unexpected entered the valley, something quieter, smaller, and untrained in the rhythm of fear. But that too belongs to what comes next. While for now the days keep passing, the echoes keep returning, and both armies remain suspended in the slow, heavy space between what has always been and what is about to change. As the days continued to pass and the ritual of the valley repeated itself, there were moments unseen by both armies, moments that unfolded away from the open space where voices echoed and fear was fed, moments when Goliath was no longer standing beneath the sky, but sitting alone, removing the heavy pieces of armor one by one, letting them fall to the ground with dull, tired sounds. And in those moments, the giant who appeared unshakable in the valley became simply a man carrying a weight that no one else could see. The armor, so admired from a distance, was not only protection but expectation, a constant reminder of who he was supposed to be. And as each piece was set aside, Goliath felt a brief relief, not just in his muscles but in his spirit. Because without the armor pressing against his chest and shoulders, there was a fleeting sense of space, as though he could breathe a little deeper. Yet even this relief carried unease, for without the armor, without the role, he was left alone with himself, and that was a place he rarely stayed for long. Strength had been his language for as long as he could remember, learned early, praised often, reinforced by the reactions of others, and over time it became easier to lift weapons than to listen inward, easier to shout than to reflect, easier to be feared than to be known. And so the armor became more than metal. It became a boundary between him and the questions he did not want to ask. Questions about who he might be if his size no longer spoke for him. There is a quiet exhaustion that comes from always having to be impressive, from never being allowed to be uncertain or small. And though Goliath's body was strong, his spirit carried the tiredness of someone who has been standing guard over an image for too long, making sure it never cracks, never slips, never reveals what lies beneath. And each morning when he prepared to return to the valley, this tiredness followed him, settling into his movements like an old ache. He told himself that the fear he inspired was proof of his purpose, that the silence on the other side of the valley confirmed his dominance. And yet somewhere beneath these thoughts, there was a subtle awareness that fear is a fragile foundation because it requires constant maintenance, constant repetition, constant noise. And the moment the noise stops, fear begins to fade, leaving behind a space that must be filled by something else, something he was not sure he possessed. Meanwhile, on the opposite side, the soldiers continued their waiting, unaware that the figure they feared carried his own kind of vulnerability. And this is often how fear works, magnifying the other while shrinking the self, until the distance between perception and reality grows so wide that it feels impossible to cross. And in that widening gap, both sides become trapped in stories that no longer serve them. The Valley of Elah remained the meeting place of these unspoken struggles, holding the contrast between outward strength and inward weariness, between loud certainty and quiet doubt. And though nothing appeared to change on the surface, beneath the repetition, something was slowly shifting, because even the strongest routines cannot fully suppress the questions that rise in stillness. At night, when the camp grew quiet and the firelight flickered low, Goliath sometimes stared into the darkness beyond the edge of the tents, listening to sounds that were not echoes of his own voice, sounds of wind, distant movement, and the soft breathing of a world that did not depend on him to be loud or large. And in those moments there was a sense, faint but persistent, that strength might not be as singular as he had believed, that there might be other ways of standing in the world that did not require constant proof. Yet morning always came, and with it the familiar preparations, the reassembly of armor, the return to the role, because change requires more than awareness. It requires willingness, and willingness often begins with surrender, a concept foreign to someone whose life had been shaped by conquest and display. And so Goliath continued, stepping once more into the valley, carrying not only metal and muscle, but the growing weight of a question he could no longer completely silence. Unseen by him, unseen by the soldiers, unseen even by the valley itself, something else was also moving toward this place, something not driven by habit or fear, but by a different rhythm entirely, one not yet shaped by the echoes of the past 40 days. And while Goliath returned to his position and the armies resumed their waiting, the story quietly prepared to turn, not through force or volume, but through the arrival of a presence that would listen before it spoke and trust before it challenged, a presence that would reveal in time how heavy the armor of the ego truly is. While the valley of Elah remained locked in its familiar pattern of waiting and echoing voices, life beyond the edges of the battlefield continued in a quieter, steadier way, untouched by the ritual of fear that had settled between the two armies. And it was within this ordinary flow of days that a different rhythm was being shaped. One not measured by armor or challenges, but by simple tasks repeated with care, by mornings that began without an audience, and by a heart that had learned to listen more than it spoke. David's days were marked by the movement of sheep rather than soldiers, by the slow passing of hours beneath open skies, where silence was not something to be filled, but something to be trusted. And in that silence, his thoughts were free to wander without pressure, to rise and fall like breath, forming a familiarity with stillness that many who lived among noise never knew. And though he did not yet stand in the valley was already shaping him in unseen ways, through the contrast of what it was and what it was not. There is a kind of strength that grows in unnoticed places, where no one is watching and nothing needs to be proven. And this strength often looks unimpressive from a distance, because it does not announce itself, it does not seek recognition, and it does not measure itself against others. And yet it roots itself deeply, nourished by trust, patience, and a sense of belonging that does not depend on comparison. David's connection to the unseen was not dramatic or loud. It was woven quietly into the rhythm of his days, into songs sung under his breath, into prayers shaped more like conversation than demand, into moments of gratitude that arose without needing a reason. And through these simple practices, his sense of identity grew stable, not inflated by praise nor diminished by obscurity, allowing him to move through the world without the constant tension of self-protection. Meanwhile, in the valley, the contrast between noise and stillness grew sharper, though few recognized it, because repetition dulls awareness, and what is loud often appears more real than what is quiet. Yet reality is not determined by volume, and the deeper movements of change rarely announce themselves in advance, preferring to arrive gently, almost unnoticed, until their presence can no longer be ignored. When David was sent by his father to carry food to his brothers at the front, the task felt ordinary. an extension of the same obedience that had shaped his daily life. And he did not travel with the weight of expectation or ambition, only with a willingness to do what was asked and return again. And it was this lightness that allowed him to enter the edges of the valley without being overwhelmed by its atmosphere. As he approached, the sounds reached him before the sight, the distant echo of Goliath's voice rolling across the land. Familiar to those who had heard it many times, but new to David, and rather than stirring fear, the sound stirred curiosity, not because David underestimated the danger, but because his inner landscape was not yet conditioned by 40 days of repetition and what others heard as inevitability. He heard simply as a voice, loud but not final. The soldiers' reactions puzzled him, their stillness, their lowered gaze, their quiet acceptance of the challenge as something immovable. And in this moment, the difference between being shaped by fear and being shaped by trust became visible, because David did not see himself in relation to Goliath first. He saw Goliath in relation to something greater, and that perspective shifted the entire weight of the scene. A different rhythm had entered the valley of Elah, one not aligned with the established pattern of intimidation and delay. And though nothing outward had yet changed, the presence of this new rhythm introduced the possibility of disruption, because systems built on fear are vulnerable to those who are not fluent in its language. And the quiet confidence that comes from trust can feel unsettling to those accustomed to control through volume. Goliath, standing in his usual place, did not yet notice this shift, because his attention was fixed on maintaining the image that had served him for so long, and the soldiers remained unaware of how close they were to a turning point. Yet beneath the surface, the meeting of two rhythms, one loud and repetitive, the other quiet and rooted, was drawing near. And when they finally collided, the outcome would not depend on size or strength, but on which rhythm proved more real. As David stood among the soldiers and listened to the familiar echo that had shaped their days, something quiet but unsettling arose within him, not anger and not fear, but a simple question that had not yet found a voice in the valley. A question that did not seek to challenge Goliath directly, but to understand why his voice had been allowed to define the space for so long. And this question lingered in David's mind as he observed the men around him, their tense shoulders, their careful avoidance of eye contact, their unspoken agreement that silence was safer than response. He noticed how fear had arranged itself not as panic but as routine, how the soldiers knew exactly when to look away and when to brace themselves for the echo. And it became clear to him that what held them in place was not the presence of danger alone, but the belief that danger was unavoidable. And beliefs, once settled, can be heavier than armor because they shape movement before the body ever has a chance to act. David's question was not loud enough to compete with the echo in the valley, but it carried a different kind of weight because it was rooted in trust rather than comparison. And when he finally spoke, his words sounded almost out of place, gentle and sincere, asking why no one would step forward, why the challenge was accepted as final, why the name of fear had been allowed to replace the memory of faith. To the soldiers who had lived under the rhythm of intimidation for 40 days, his words felt disruptive, even naive, because they threatened the fragile stability they had built around their fear. And when fear becomes familiar, it begins to defend itself, dismissing anything that suggests change as unrealistic or dangerous. And so David's question was met not with relief, but with resistance. Some looked at him with irritation, others with concern, and still others with a kind of quiet envy, because his calm revealed what they had lost: the ability to see the situation without the weight of accumulated dread. And in their responses, the difference between experience shaped by fear and experience shaped by trust became even more pronounced. Because while they measured the threat by size and outcome, David measured it by meaning and allegiance. The question he asked did not demand an immediate answer, and that was what made it powerful. Because unanswered questions linger, creating space where certainty once ruled. And in that space, even the loudest narratives begin to weaken, not through force, but through doubt about their own authority. Meanwhile, Goliath continued his routine, unaware that his dominance was being quietly questioned, not through confrontation, but through curiosity. And this shift mattered, because fear thrives on unquestioned assumptions. And the moment those assumptions are examined, fear begins to lose its grip. Even if the outward situation remains unchanged, the Valley of Elah, so accustomed to receiving echoes, now held something new, a question that did not return as sound but settled into the minds of those who heard it, gently unsettling the certainty that had kept them still. And though no one yet moved, the first step had been taken, not across the valley, but inward, where the most significant battles are often decided. David did not yet know where this question would lead him, only that it felt necessary to speak it. And sometimes necessity arises not from confidence in the outcome, but from clarity about what must no longer be accepted. And in this quiet clarity, the story edged closer to its turning point, as the valley waited to see whether the question would be silenced or allowed to grow into action. The question David had spoken did not disappear after the words faded. Instead, it moved quietly from one heart to another, unsettling the stillness that had felt so fixed. Because once fear is questioned, it can no longer rest as comfortably as before. And even those who dismissed David outwardly felt something shift inward, a subtle discomfort, as though a window had been opened in a room long kept closed. News of this young voice reached places David never intended it to reach, carried not by intention, but by attention, because anything that breaks a pattern draws notice. And in a camp shaped by repetition, difference stands out quickly. And so it was not long before David found himself standing before authority, before those whose role it was to maintain order, structure, and predictability in the face of uncertainty. King Saul listened, his posture heavy with the accumulated weight of leadership. And as David spoke, Saul did not only hear words, he felt the contrast between two ways of standing in the world, one burdened by responsibility, history, and consequence, the other light, unencumbered by expectation. And this contrast stirred something complex within him, a mixture of hope and doubt, because while courage is admired, it is also feared when it threatens established ways of coping. David's confidence did not sound like defiance. It sounded like trust. And trust can feel unsettling to those who have learned to survive by control, because control relies on managing outcomes, while trust rests in relationship. And these two postures rarely coexist easily. And so Saul responded the only way he knew how, by offering armor, by attempting to translate trust into something measurable, something visible, something that fit within the familiar language of strength. The armor placed upon David was heavy, awkward, ill-fitting, and as he stood there trying to move beneath its weight, the symbolism became clear even if it was not spoken, because the armor represented more than protection. It represented an identity shaped by fear and comparison. An identity that assumed survival required imitation of power rather than alignment with purpose. And David felt immediately that this was not his path. When he set the armor aside, the act was simple but deeply disruptive, because refusing the armor was not a rejection of safety, it was a rejection of the belief that fear's tools were necessary to face fear itself. And in that moment, David unknowingly challenged not only Goliath, but the entire system that had allowed Goliath to dominate for so long. Meanwhile, across the valley, Goliath continued to prepare himself, unaware that his presence was no longer unquestioned. Yet something in the air had shifted, subtle but real, because when an ego built on fear senses resistance, even before it is seen, it responds instinctively, often by becoming louder, more rigid, more certain of its own importance. Goliath's identity had grown inseparable from his dominance, and dominance depends on being unchallenged, not merely in action, but in belief. And now, without knowing why, he felt the faint pressure of disruption, as though the valley no longer received his voice in the same unquestioning way. And this discomfort stirred a deeper need to assert himself, to remind the world of who he was supposed to be. Two movements were now set in motion, one external and visible, another internal and unseen, one driven by ego-seeking reinforcement, the other by trust-seeking alignment, and the Valley of Elah stood between them, not as a battlefield yet, but as a threshold, a place where identities are tested and truth revealed. And as David stepped away from the armor, and Goliath stepped further into his role, the distance between them became more than physical. It became symbolic, marking the space where fear and trust were about to meet face to face. As David walked away from the weight he had refused, his steps became lighter, not because the path ahead was easy, but because it was clear, and clarity often brings a quiet strength that noise cannot imitate. And as he moved toward the stream, the world around him seemed to slow, the sounds of the camp fading into the background, replaced by the gentle movement of water, steady and patient, flowing without effort or display. He knelt by the stream and let his hand move through the cool water, not searching in haste, not driven by urgency, but guided by familiarity, because this was not his first time choosing what was simple and overlooked. And as he selected smooth stones, he did so with attention rather than fear, knowing that what matters most is not the size of what we carry, but the trust with which we carry it. Each stone he picked up was shaped by time rather than force, formed through countless moments of contact, pressure, and release. And in this they carried a quiet wisdom, a reminder that transformation often happens gradually, unnoticed, and that what becomes effective is not always what appears impressive, but what has learned to remain steady through change. As David rose and turned back toward the valley, the stillness within him remained intact, a stillness not of passivity, but of alignment. Because when a person knows why they are moving forward, they no longer need to hurry or shout. And this inner quiet contrasted sharply with the tension that had filled the valley for so long, introducing a presence that did not seek to dominate the space, but to belong within it. Across the open ground, Goliath saw David approaching and responded with laughter and scorn, his voice rising once more, louder, sharper, fueled by the need to reassert the hierarchy that had defined him. And yet beneath the sound, there was an edge of disbelief, because ego struggles to interpret what does not follow its rules, and a figure that refuses to be intimidated threatens the entire structure built on intimidation. David listened without absorbing the noise, his attention anchored elsewhere, not on the volume of the challenge, but on the steadiness of his own breath, the familiarity of his movement, and the presence he trusted beyond what could be seen. And in this anchoring, the imbalance between them became clear, because one relied on being heard, while the other relied on listening. The valley held its breath once more, but this time the silence felt different, less heavy, more expectant, as though something long delayed was finally being allowed to happen. And in that moment, the distance between fear and trust was reduced to a single step, a single motion, a single choice made without spectacle. When David placed the stone into his sling, the action was unremarkable to the eye, yet profound in meaning because it represented the meeting of preparation and faith, of skill learned in obscurity and courage expressed in the open. And as he lifted his arm, the movement carried with it not aggression, but intention, focused and calm. The stone flew, not driven by anger or desperation, but by precision shaped through repetition and patience. And as it moved through the air, it crossed more than physical distance. It crossed the space between illusion and truth, between ego inflated by fear and trust grounded in stillness, and in that crossing, the story reached the edge of revelation, where what appears powerful is tested against what is real. The moment the stone reached its mark was not marked by thunder or spectacle, but by an unexpected quiet, a pause so complete that it seemed as though the valley itself had forgotten how to echo. And in that brief suspension of sound, something far greater than a single body losing balance took place, because the voice that had filled the air for 40 days stopped mid-breath, and with it, the spell of inevitability began to break. Goliath staggered, not only from the impact, but from the sudden collapse of certainty, because ego depends on continuity, on the assurance that what has always worked will continue to work. And when that continuity is interrupted, even the strongest posture can falter. And as he fell, the sound that followed was not a roar, but a dull finality, the sound of weight meeting ground, heavy and unmistakable. The valley did not immediately erupt in noise, because those who had lived under fear often need time to recognize its absence. And in those seconds of stunned stillness, the soldiers stood frozen, not in terror this time, but in disbelief, as though their minds were slowly adjusting to a reality they had not allowed themselves to imagine. A reality in which the loudest voice no longer dictated what was possible. What fell that day was not only a giant, but a narrative, a story that said strength must look a certain way, that authority belongs to size and volume, that fear is wisdom. And as that story crumbled, it revealed how fragile it had always been, sustained not by truth, but by repetition and consent. David did not stand over the fallen figure in triumph, because triumph was never his aim, and without an audience in his heart, he had no need to perform for one outside of himself. And this absence of celebration carried its own kind of power, because it showed that the victory belonged not to ego replacing ego, but to something quieter taking its rightful place. Across the valley, the soldiers began to breathe again, some deeply, some shakily, as if awakening from a long-held tension. And in that breathing, bodies remembered what courage felt like before fear had taught them to forget, and movement returned, tentative at first, then growing steadier, as the weight they had carried for 40 days lifted without being replaced by another burden. The silence where Goliath's voice once lived felt strange, almost empty, because noise leaves an imprint even after it stops, And into that emptiness came a realization that fear had occupied more space than it deserved, and that much of its power had come from being believed rather than from being true. Goliath lay still, no longer a mirror for others' insecurity, no longer a symbol demanding response, and in his stillness, the truth became clear that ego, once exposed, cannot sustain itself without the attention it feeds upon. And when that attention is withdrawn, it collapses under its own weight. The Valley of Elah, which had held echoes for so long, now held something else. A quiet understanding spreading gently through the space that what changes the course of a life or a people is rarely force alone, but the willingness to stand differently, to listen more deeply, and to trust something greater than fear. And as this understanding settled, the valley began to feel less like a battleground and more like a place of passage, where one way of being had ended and another had begun. When the movement finally began, it was not driven by rage or the thrill of conquest, but by release, like a body stretching after being held too long in one position. And the people crossed the valley not as those rushing toward an enemy, but as those stepping into a space newly cleared of dread, unsure at first, yet lighter with every step they took. The Philistines fled, but their retreat carried none of the confidence that had once followed Goliath's voice, because fear can scatter just as quickly as it gathers. And when the source of intimidation disappears, what remains is often confusion rather than resistance. A reminder that power borrowed from fear cannot stand on its own. Among the Israelites, there was movement, sound, and rising voices. Yet beneath it all flowed something gentler, an undercurrent of relief and quiet amazement, because what had happened challenged not only their enemy, but their understanding of themselves, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truth that the barrier had never been only across the valley, but also within their own hearts. David moved through the aftermath without urgency, his expression unchanged, his steps steady, as though the moment he had prepared for in solitude had already passed. And what followed felt less significant than the alignment that had allowed it to happen, because true turning points often feel strangely calm to the one who has already faced them long before the world noticed. Whispers spread quickly, names repeated, stories reshaped in real time. Yet David remained largely untouched by the noise, not out of pride, but out of grounding, because he had not acted to be seen, and therefore did not need to be defined by what others now said about him. King Saul watched from a distance, his mind unsettled, not by the defeat of the Philistine, but by the emergence of something he could not categorize or control, because authority rooted in fear struggles to understand courage rooted in trust. And this tension marked the beginning of a complicated recognition rather than a simple celebration. The valley itself bore marks of what had passed: disturbed earth, scattered armor, footprints crossing and overlapping, and yet above it all lingered a sense of quiet reset, as though the land had exhaled, relieved of carrying the weight of a story that no longer needed to be told in the same way. As evening approached, the light softened, and the sharp edges of the day gave way to long shadows and cooler air, inviting reflection rather than reaction. And in that slowing, the people began to realize that the true work was not finished with the fall of a giant, because fear, once challenged, does not vanish completely. It retreats, waiting to see what will replace it. David, now at the edge of the camp, looked not toward the fallen enemy, but toward the quiet hills beyond, aware that this moment would follow him into future valleys of a different kind, where giants would not wear armor or speak aloud. And in that awareness, the story gently shifted its focus from a single victory to a lifelong journey of choosing trust over fear, again and again, in ways both seen and unseen. Night settled gently over the camp, and with it came a different kind of silence. Not the tense silence that waits for a threat to speak, but the soft silence that follows understanding, where questions replace fear and reflections replaces urgency. And in that quiet, the story of the day began to move inward, away from the valley and into the hearts of those who would carry it forward. David sat apart from the noise, not because he was separate from the people, but because moments like this often invite solitude. And as the firelight flickered across familiar faces and unfamiliar expressions of respect, he remained grounded in the same simplicity that had guided him all along, aware that what had happened did not elevate him above others, but called him deeper into responsibility. The victory, now already becoming a story, risked being misunderstood, because it is easy to remember the fall of a giant and forget the years of quiet preparation, the unseen faithfulness, the ordinary days that shape a person long before a defining moment arrives. And David sensed that the true lesson would not be preserved by celebration alone, but by how it was lived out in the days that followed. For the people, sleep came more easily that night, because fear no longer stood guard at the edge of their thoughts, and rest returned not as escape, but as restoration, reminding them that peace is not the absence of conflict forever, but the presence of trust even when uncertainty remains. Some would remember the size of Goliath, others the speed of the stone, but a few would carry something quieter, the understanding that what seems immovable can shift, that what feels overwhelming can be faced, and that courage does not always announce itself. It often arrives calmly, dressed in familiarity, asking only to be trusted. In the distance, the valley lay still under the stars, no longer defined by the echoes of challenge, but by the memory of a moment when fear lost its voice. And though new valleys would come, with new giants shaped differently, the pattern had been set, showing that the way forward is not always through force, but through alignment, patience, and a willingness to stand as who you truly are. And as the night deepened, the story loosened its grip on the waking mind, becoming something softer, something that could be carried into sleep, where meaning continues its work without effort. And in that gentle drifting, the listener is left not with noise or urgency, but with a calm reminder that whatever giant waits beyond tomorrow, it does not decide the ending. And in this knowing, the heart can finally rest, allowing the body to slow, the breath to soften, and the soul to quietly fall asleep in peace.